Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's Maynard and Mike Bradley, Colin Fenton, and a special guest appearance from Matthew Taylor in our Calgary office, here to do Close of Business Tuesday. We're really excited. We have found yet another friend in our tour of the world to find people who have interesting thoughts about energy and the changing world we live in. Today, we're really excited to welcome Gregory Wrightstone. He is a geologist by training, 35 years of experience doing that. He is the executive director of the CO2 Coalition, and he's recently written a book, Facts, the Science That Al Gore Doesn't Want You to Know. And so he's an acclaimed author and lecturer and interviewee, I should say. And we're really excited to have you, Gregory. Thank you for joining us.
Sure thing. Glad to be here.
Well, let's kick it off today. Mike Bradley, let's talk a little bit about the crude world, the gas world, the stocks, what's on your mind. I know we teased you with a question, which is, can energy companies issue equity? So you're going to chew on that one, but let me turn it over to you and let you let it rip.
Yeah, Maynard. One of the things that's going on right now is crude oil has started the week off on a positive note. I think a lot of that is just U.S. dollar weakness today, continued optimism over fiscal stimulus. You've got WTI up to 53 now, and Brent almost $56 a barrel, and so that's great. And you see the XLE, the XOP up, but the oil service index generally flat to down today. And why is that? Well, what's going on today is Halliburton reported earnings, pretty good earnings. They laid out how they see the environment unfolding here in Q1 in 2021. And I think the main takeaway from their presentation is that North America is going to continue to recover like it has been, and international is going to get stronger sooner than people thought. I think most people were thinking more sort of second half. They said that Q1 is going to be the bottom here. So that was generally a surprise. So you had Halliburton today, and you're going to have Baker and Schlumberger later this week, and so they'll set the tone for the service market. In regards to what we want to talk a little bit about today was a question you posed. Is like, can E&P companies issue equity? Yeah, anything is possible. The stocks have come up a long way, and so a couple of things I'd say to that. First of all, it really depends on what you're issuing the equity for. If you're issuing the equity to retire debt that's onerous and to get your balance sheet in better shape, I think the market's going to be more forgiving to that today. You're not going to be marked down 15 or 20% like you were in the past, number one. Number two, E&Ps are dialing in around $47, $48 long-term prices. Right now, you're sitting with a strip of 52 to 53. And I think normalized is probably in the $50, $55 range. So issuing an equity today might be a good idea if it's under the right circumstances, but we're still going to be issuing equity below what is the strip right now, maybe what's below normalized. And so the final thing I'd really say is, I think the better option right now, if you're an E&P company or a service company, as a matter of fact, is to probably go the convert route. I think the convert route, you can probably get something done in the low single digits. You can retire mid-single digit type debt. That's going to be positive. And with these call features that Jason Wood has talked about in converts, you're going to be able to price these equities up 50, 60, even 70%. And therefore, instead of basically issuing equity at a sort of $47, $48, $49 normalized, you're doing it mid-50s. That's a pretty good proposition. And so I think that's probably the better route. I think that's where we're going to be at this point in time. So we'll just leave it at that.
Okay, those are interesting comments. I mean, in a way, who can believe we were even asking that question? Given where we've been. Matt Taylor, welcome. I think this is the first time we've roped you into a close of business. Matt is up in our Calgary office. He covers infrastructure, a lot of things in Canada. All around smart guy, working with our Calgary team, which is a big part of our research team. Matt, we roped you in this weekend. As we saw the news, or at least the speculation was starting around Keystone and what might happen and how important that is to Canada. And so welcome. Tell us what you're hearing, thinking, feeling, saying, etc. around Keystone and what it might mean for all of us.
Yeah, thanks for including me here, Maynard. Long time listener, first time caller here, so excited to be here. In terms of Keystone XL, so there's a pretty violent reaction that happened yesterday, which that was surprising to us in terms of the stocks, because this is something that has been in the rhetoric for Joe Biden's campaign since at least May, where he came out and said that he was willing to stand and revoke the permit, very similar to Obama. So this isn't something that was new, this rhetoric about Keystone XL and the potential for it to have its permitting revoked. But I think what's vastly different than when he was vice president with Barack Obama back in 2015 is how different this project really is as it stands today in 2020. Because what got lost in the noise yesterday was TC Energy came out with an announcement that they're going to have the project be zero emissions by startup in 2023. And then their plan was to fully source renewable power for the project by 2030. So not only being carbon neutral, but actually being a part of this very important energy transition. Because then you layer that on top of two other steps that they had taken to try to have indigenous owners. So there's National Law Energy Group, that is various bands of indigenous groups that were planning to become equity owners. And then the third prong to the stool was the focus on labor unions and having those being an integral part of the process. So in terms of making it the most politically sound, or at least having the appetite for the project, you could argue that the project was very, very different than 2015. But I think what you're seeing today, and in conversations that we've had both with the media and investors, is there's a focus by this administration on day one to have a real put a real foot forward on decarbonization. So, right next to revoke the presidential permit for Keystone XL is also to re-enter the Paris Agreement. So, unfortunately, I think that's what's happening for Canada and for Alberta is that this project is quite literally could become more of a political tool, as opposed to looking at the need for the pipeline and then also steps that they've taken to make this very sustainable, and you could argue an integral piece of the reliability going forward. So, our view is that those steps were well taken, but if you take him at his word, our belief is that it will in fact have this presidential permit revoked here in the near term. So what does that mean? What that means is that you've had about $1.2 billion of investment, both by shippers and the company itself, be lost, and then you also have the Alberta government that had committed $1.1 billion US to build the project. So there's vast implications, not only in terms of investment, but also in terms of jobs, property tax revenue, and et cetera. So a key question that we've been getting is, so what does this mean longer term if you're taking a piece of critical infrastructure out of the equation? There are other projects that are in queue, the Trans Mountain Pipeline being built by the government, and also Line 3, which is a replacement project that's supposed to add additional capacity. So there are other options in terms of getting oil to market. But in terms of having a project, like I had said, with various steps that they had taken to make it a sustainable project, you're going to be taking about 830,000 barrels a day out of potential infrastructure additions in the longer term. So was it needed is a key question investors have asked. You can make an argument under current strip pricing, no. But if things do change in the next couple of years and there is modest growth, looking a couple of years out, will this project be repurposed or reimagined? Our view is that with Biden in office for at least 4 years, that the company is going to shelf this. So effectively, Keystone XL, as we know it, should be canceled in short order. But I think the main takeaway for us is, even despite companies' best efforts to make this a project that could be a key piece in moving forward. I think it's really unfortunate that this would be the step forward that's being taken.
What would you say, Matt, is the chance that it's not canceled?
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question, because there's avenues that both TC Energy and the Alberta government are going to take. If you recall that the company had appealed the Obama decision, we never got resolution from that because that permit was appealed in 2015, and then President Trump took office in 2016, and that was one of the things that he had decided to make a priority from day one. So we never saw a resolution of that. So there will be an appeals process, but in terms of it going forward, there's a path forward that they could try to seek new permits. We think that's unlikely. That appeal process is probably seeking for damages as opposed to actually restarting the project. So that being restarted, I think, is unlikely. I think it's going to come down to, you've seen headlines that Trudeau is going to talk to Joe Biden and his administration about the pipeline. I think that's really the path forward. But when you have Justin Trudeau that's already backed Trans Mountain and has invested taxpayer money to have that pipeline completed, we think it's unfortunately probably a low likelihood that if he does in fact revoke the presidential permit, he being Joe Biden, that effectively the project will be canceled.
Do you think there's any chance he doesn't revoke it? Is anybody hoping that Trudeau or somebody talks him into not doing that?
Yeah, there's a chance, Maynard, and I think it's important to point out those three things that I talked about, that they have plans to make it zero emissions, that they wanted to have it fully sourced by renewables by 2030, by having Indigenous communities be stakeholders, and then also having unions perform the labor. So I think there's a lot of stakeholders that have a vested interest and would like to see the project go forward, because I think it's important to make that point that what it was in 2015 is very different than what it is today in 2020. So you ask the probability, I think it's less than 10%, because what you would need for Joe Biden to do and his administration is have the belief that they could show their willingness and commitment to decarbonization through other political levers that they could pull. And for us, it seems like an easy one to pull right now is to rescind that presidential permit.
Is there one company, a renewable company, that is most levered to doing this work on behalf of the project? Like one company that stands the most to gain that could be brought into the discussion, or is it just generically something they're planning to do?
Part of it is they're going to self-power a lot of those projects themselves, like they've talked previously doing with some of their assets, whether it's doing something that Williams and Enbridge have done and building solar farms or connecting into wind farms. So I think there's multiple companies besides just TC Energy self-powering itself, because there would be developers in multiple states. So this is a pipeline that extends from Alberta right down to the Gulf Coast. So you are touching a lot of communities. You're going to be in a lot of companies' backyards that I think could have been involved in this repowering and renewable initiative and effort, and really trying to join hydrocarbon infrastructure expansion and this transition to renewable energy.
I mean, I think as energy people, we're all sad to see this discussion. It's too bad this can't be the greatest win ever, because we found a way to go forward with this project that's been the subject to much debate, and we're doing it in a zero emission alternative energy partnership type form. It could have been a poster child for the middle way, but I don't know. We'll keep our fingers crossed that something better happens. Any last thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, I'd like to echo that sentiment, because I think a message here from TPH is that this transition is real, but it's going to take some time. And so I think that is a nice way to frame it, Maynard, that this was going to help bridge that gap by making this project the most eco-friendly, renewable conscious, sustainable pipeline that's ever been built. And so I think that also is our view, is that it was a nice way to bridge the gap as we, in fact, take this transition seriously. And so I think it is unfortunate that that wouldn't be considered in that context, that this project is not just a tar sand pipeline that was conceived in 2008 that they're trying to push forward. But in fact, you could argue the same progress has even been made in the conception of this pipeline to now in 2021.
I think our only mistake, we should have let Biden think of it. And then he could have announced, I've come up with this solution. Every politician loves that. All right, I'll stop with the political psychoanalysis. Thank you, Matt. We really appreciate you. Colin Fenton, I know you've got a few choice slides for us while Gregory's getting ready to talk CO2 with us.
I do, but just to pick up that last point, it does seem that the Biden team was caught off guard by the investor response. So I think it is important to stress that this has not actually been announced yet as a day one proposal. It was on a sheet that was circulated, and it's going to crowd out the message on Paris, rejoining Paris. And so just from a political perspective, it was a tactical mistake to sort of pick a fight with your neighbor and one of your best friends, as opposed to staying focused on what was supposed to be the story of the United States is rejoining Paris. The United States is going to do something on COVID. So I think we should not be surprised if this story quietly goes into the background in the next couple of days. Certainly, it could come back at any moment in time. But my sense is markets and their violent reaction to that, they were heard, and that's important. Let me just go through 3 slides to connect to some of the themes we've been talking about in recent months. The first is this dollar debasement story that we've been talking about is now seeping from paper markets into the real world. And here on the left-hand side, you're looking at U.S. imports of crude oil from Saudi Arabia coming into 2021. For the first time in 35 years, 0 barrels per day of imports from Saudi Arabia into the United States. This extends a trend that's been here for a while. You can see some of the effect of the would-be price war back in the spring. But basically, the question is, if we do not get in the United States imports from Canada through those incremental pipelines, that implies a greater dependency to go right back to Saudi Arabia, probably to the tune of 500 to 800,000 barrels per day under normalized refinery operations. One other effect that we're seeing, of course, remember your economics textbooks about J-curves. When the US dollar depreciates, it makes exports boom out of the United States. And at the start of 2021, 4.7 million barrels per day of crude oil and propane exports. About 1 million plus of that was the propane. The balance was crude, but just a very notable way to be starting this year. Nothing from Saudi Arabia and a lot leaving the United States for places like China and elsewhere. The second chart we want to show,
on that quick question, Colin, on the Saudi Arabia thing, because that is a shocking stat. So 35 years ago, 85-ish into 86, was that, do you think that was the Saudis just curtailing barrels because they were trying to control the oil markets then? Like, I'm surprised when you said it was 0, I'm surprised it wasn't, 50 years ago, the last time it was that low.
Well, remember, without getting lost in the history, the early part of the 80s was a period of recovery from the double dip recession of 1980 to 82. So there was a bit of a demand shock still in its later stages, but strong enough to not have the import demand pull from the United States side. And we were also tiptoeing at that point in time to the famous Saudi flooding of markets in 86, 87 to really kill the price and push back on competitors at that time, notably Mexico, Russia, and others. So there were some idiosyncratic geopolitics happening in 1985. For the most part, as you can see in this chart, the U.S. Has been a good and reliable importer from Saudi Arabia, but really, even pre-COVID, we've been having kind of the consequences of the shale boom, the LTO boom, light tight oil, plus this dollar effect get us down to this surprising result. It's only 1 week of data, but I thought it was worthy of notice.
I mean, not to sound get carried away, but every American should know that fact. It's pretty incredible.
It's pretty incredible. I mean, and you can see that spike in the spring where essentially that first week of March put a lot of barrels into VLCCs, took them 40 days to discharge. It was not as much of a price effect as many people think it was. The demand shock was way more important than that tussle between Saudi Arabia and Russia. But if the Biden administration does follow through on this antagonistic approach to Canada. It's not like the United States is not going to be importing crude. We'll just get it from a different place. But instead of the Canadians, now will be places like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and so on. All right, slide 2. We thought this was worthy of note. This is the ICE futures contract for carbon emissions. In the week of January 15th, the average price for the spot was 34 euros and change per ton. Given the existing euro dollar cross, that's an average of about $41.65. You can see where it is relative to the recent past, under 16 as recently as the end of March. I thought it was useful to point out that when President Trump took the oath of office in 2017, this price was 5 euros per ton, about where it was when President Obama took the oath of office for the second time. So part of this is the energy transition really beginning to gain some legs in carbon emission allowances and other prices of carbon. And then finally, what we've seen since the presidential election in the United States, in part because of the Biden victory, but also in part because of the vaccine being announced and having this incredible effectiveness, we've gotten the increase in price, flat prices certainly, but also through the forward curve, and producers have begun to layer hedges into that strength, mostly in the 2021 tenors, which I have here mostly in blue, but even in the 2022 tenors. Looking only at the $45 puts across these contract months, that total open interest was 17.6 million barrels, right ahead of the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday. As of today, it's 42.4 million barrels. And when you look at the put premium for March, June, December, and so on, right ahead of the election, these prices were in the range of $9 to $10.50 premium. As we got into 2021, they had really come down hard. And now here in the prompt March, that's really time decay. It's giving you this 33-cent premium. But just in the past week, threshold levels are being triggered that are making these hedges much more attractive for producers. So an indication that producers are smartly understanding that there are still some pockets of risk in the balance of 2021 where we may hit some weaker spots for demand. You can already see that in the natural gas market because of weather. And certainly if we did have any kind of policy mistake that hurt the recovery, some of these opportunities to hedge at the $45 and $50 level in the medium part of the WTI forward curve are proving attractive for producers.
So Colin, let me ask you one of those big brain questions that you're so good at. If you're a research analyst and you're forecasting oil prices, do you go and look at things like what you just showed, the cost of a put at $45 in the course of 2021, and when you see that it is getting cheaper and cheaper to buy that put, do you derive confidence that oil prices will be higher? And therefore, do you think research analysts, and Mike, you jump in here too, but do forecasters look at that? And I mean, really on the equity side of the house, do they look at those kinds of prices when they're coming up with oil price forecasts?
Yes and no. Some do. It's really more the macro community that does. And, we, among others, will use the Black-Scholes theorem and those equations to back out the implied probabilities. But, no small measure of caution has to be attached to that because, of course, what's really happening is there is, a greater propensity for these round numbers like a 45 or 50 or 55. So it's not necessarily the opinion. It's a liquidity weighted expression of fear about things that may happen in the future and buying an insurance product guarding against even low probability but high impact events. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the person thinks price A or price B is going to happen. But when we do have the volatility structures roughly around long run averages as they are today, and the wings are pretty well behaved, I do think it is information carrying. It does give you a sense of when greed and fear are passing the baton between each other. I think you'll find that most professional forecasters would view the Black-Scholes derived probabilities as too pessimistic because you're building in that insurance component as well. And so what you'll often find is, for example, the median forecast based off of options tradings might say $48, but the weighted average of the street says 53. And that's because that's really the view of what's going to happen as opposed to the fear of what might happen.
I'd say from an equity standpoint, I think in the last couple of years, or maybe pretty much forever, I think most people would look at the hedging as a sign that these E&Ps are going to really start to spend. And I think the difference now is they're hedging not because they're going to spend, they just want to lock in cash flows because returns is the name of the game now. So I think there's two different markets developing here.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mike. Well, Colin, I was going to say you've given us ideas for guests for the next show. We're going to invite greed and fear on and let them, talk to each other.
They do tend to spend a lot of time with each other. Yeah.
Well, speaking of guests on the show, we're really delighted to have Gregory Wrightstone join us. I think one of the things that's been super fun for us is as we've been doing these things, friends recommend friends and we get to meet more people. And Gregory came, a good friend of the firm, said, you have got to meet this guy. You will really enjoy his thoughts. And so we want to thank the Friend Network for continuing to help us meet really interesting people like Gregory. And Gregory, in the lead-in, I said facts. I should have said inconvenient facts, the science that Al Gore doesn't want you to know. There you go, pointing to it right behind you. But look, we're so pleased to have you join us. And let me turn the floor over to you just to kind of kick it off. And I know you've got some slides that you can take us through as well. So welcome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me on. And I know TPH well, having been in the industry for many years. In fact, that's a big piece of Marcellus shale right there behind me. This
nice.
Nice. I was actually the co-author of the first comprehensive paper on the Marcellus shale. So it's pretty. So I know TPH, well-respected name. We already talked about the Keystone XL Pipeline. I don't think we need to go into that anymore. The other thing that came out.
Actually, I mean, Gregory, I think we get so many people that watch these. If you have anything to add to that discussion, it's such a talk about something that is, I don't know. It's in the public domain as a something that is a climate debate. So you are welcome to add more to Keystone if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, well, it's whether or not it's needed. It'll be what it does. It's more impactful than from him taking us out of this and removing the permit. It speaks more to what he's probably going to do in the future and the dangers that we see from other things coming up. Some really harmful, economically harmful things that he could do. And maybe at this point, I should describe my climate change philosophy, and that is that we should use all of the Earth's resources for the betterment of mankind and do it as good stewards. I mean, that's pretty basic. But one of the other things, so I'd come up with a series of talking points. I've been doing a lot of interviews about XL. The main thing that the premier of Alberta had come up with, he listed three things. One would kill jobs on both sides of the border. It'll harm Canadian-U.S. relationships, and it'll harm U.S. energy security. It could lead to more wars for oil. None of us want our sons and daughters and grandkids fighting another war for oil. So this would do nothing to help that. The other thing, just today, the U.S. Court of Appeals in District of Columbia, where I'm calling you from, vacated Trump's Affordable Clean Energy rule. I'm kind of okay with that. Both the Obama Clean Power Plan and the Trump's Affordable Clean Energy affected electricity generation. But both of them are highly flawed, in my opinion, because they started with the assumption that carbon dioxide is bad for the earth and bad for humanity. And what we'll talk a little bit about, and what we talk at the CO2 Coalition, are if you actually look in the real world, what's happening today, if we look, the modest warming that we've seen since the beginning of the 20th century, combined with increasing CO2, is having an overwhelmingly beneficial effect on both the Earth's ecosystems and on humanity. by almost every metric we look at. Things are getting better, not worse. So it was really, again, both of these things, Obama's plan and the Trump plan, were both what I would consider to be solutions in search of a problem. Because again, with us, we here at the CO2 Coalition are big proponents of the many benefits of CO2. If we take a look at the great climate debate, I boil it down to two issues. The first one is the climate change that we're seeing, the rise in temperature, the increase in CO2, is it leading to catastrophic consequences? If it is, that's a problem. Or is it leading to many beneficial effects to both humanity and Earth's ecosystems? And the second part of this is really highlighted by Dr. Mann's hockey stick. It's he and Al Gore and Greta and the rest would contend that the Earth's temperature that we're seeing today is unusual and unprecedented. Those two words, unusual and unprecedented, over the scale of thousands of years. It's never been this warm before, and it's never risen at the rates that we've seen over the last decades. If that were the case, if the Earth's temperature was warming faster and at higher rates ever seen in thousands of years, well, that would provide strong support, wouldn't it, for man's emissions of greenhouse gases are leading to this. The other aspect that we look at is if they're not unusual and unprecedented, that we can look back through Earth's history, and as a geologist, that's what I do, and we see other warming periods that were similar or warmer than today, then that would provide strong support that man's emissions of greenhouse gases are not the primary mover of the temperature. That's actually, this is just part of the natural cycles. And so if we look at this, we got here this 97% consensus. Well, there is a consensus on some things. CO2 is increasing. Everybody agrees. Nearly all the CO2 increase is man-made. Everybody agrees. And temperature has risen a little less than a degree centigrade since the mid-19th century. The big disagreement here, though, is it primarily due to man-made increases in CO2, or is it driven primarily by the same natural forces that have been driving temperature really since the dawn of time? So this is the famous, most impactful chart ever created about climate change. I think I can state that pretty categorically, by Dr. Michael Mann. It's called the hockey stick, where he reconstructed temperature. He saw 900 years of slowly declining temperature. And then all of a sudden, at the beginning of the 20th century, just as CO2 started increasing, we had this great ramp up in temperature. And my next book that I'm working on is really dealing with the takedown, complete destruction of this. We'll look at some of the things that were wrong with it to give you an idea. I like Mark Stein, the acerbic commentator, his description of this. He said the hockey stick is a reconstruction of temperature based on proxies with two problems: the reconstruction and the proxies. Other than that, you can take it to the bank. And we'll just go through some, what I call the inconvenient climate data. We're not going to go through a whole lot of this, but I think it's important to look at this. This is carbon dioxide emissions. And you can see it really ramped up in the mid-20th century. And that's prior to the World War II. There really couldn't have been any carbon dioxide created warming in the atmosphere. It just wasn't high enough. If we look back over the last 100,000 years of data, which takes us back to the beginning of this last ice age, we see that it really started ramping up in this current, what we call the interglacial period. And what we find as we look at these, that temperature predated changes in CO2. So as it warmed up, the oceans expelled CO2 and the atmosphere increased. Atmospheric CO2 increased. We can see this time after time. It's just 400,000 years of data. Again, anything we see here that's blue is CO2. You can see during each of the warming periods that are in the pinkish color. And if we take a look, we're being told that CO2 levels are, again, wildly overblown. It's not been like this in millions of years, and they're right. But if we look throughout Earth's history, dating back to the Precambrian, 600 million years of data here, we see that actually our CO2 levels today at about 400 parts per million, at some of the lowest levels of CO2 in the history of the Earth. The average throughout Earth's history is 2,600 parts per million, 6 times what they are today. And life flourished and blossomed during these previous times. The red line at the bottom is what I call the line of death. That's 150 parts per million, and we nearly got there during the last ice age. This is the scariest chart that I include in my book. Again, the red line is the line of death, and it's because plant life can't survive. Most plant life cannot survive below 150 parts per million, and we nearly got there in the not too distant past. If we had ever crossed that line, that would be a true climate apocalypse event.
So, Gregory, just so we all understand those charts about how, hundreds of millions of years ago, there was so much CO2 in the environment, and now there's seemingly so little by comparison. What caused that reduction in CO2?
Well, a lot of it was just natural sequestration. If you look at limestone, for example, is calcium carbonate, CaCO3. So just the creation of lots of limestone sucks lots of CO2 out of the atmosphere. The Marcellus Shale, the Utica Shale, all these mudstones that we're exploring for, these have high. We always, when we look and analyze a mudstone for its viability, we look at the TOC, total organic carbon. And so these shales, now we're liberating that carbon dioxide that was created, and a lot of these are algal blooms back in the Eagleford Shale, Marcellus, and these other shales. Algae would explode and suck up CO2, and then it would fall down and accumulate at the bottom to form these rocks that we're liberating that millions of years old CO2 level. And so the story there with this slide is that we don't have too much CO2. We're actually CO2 impoverished. What I see when I look through here and I look at the data, I find an Earth that's thriving and prospering, and humanity's benefiting from the same. A little humor here on polar bears, but before I end up here, I wanted to, your listeners and viewers may not have heard of the CO2 Coalition. We're a group of 60 of the top scientists, engineers, economists, statisticians that are skeptical about the human causes, relationship, and we dispute the notion that our changing climate is leading to catastrophic consequences. We've got Dick Lindzen from MIT, Will Happer from Princeton. You can see Pat Michaels, who I'm sitting next to his office here in Arlington, Virginia. You can see he's on with Mark Levin. These are some of the top scientists in the world, and we're fighting back using science, facts, and data to fight back against this radicalized notion of catastrophic man-made warming.
This is obviously a really complex topic. I mean, you're 35 years of geology and scientific experience. You're talking about data sets. Some of those pages were hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years of data, and all kinds of complicated scientific things. One of the problems with the debate, besides the lack of civility in today's world, is that how is a layman supposed to understand any of this? And the citizens of the world are the voters of the world, and how do the politicians understand this? So how do we get a good, thoughtful debate going on where we are and what we should be doing? Because it's just such a polarized discussion.
It is polarized, and it's exacerbated by what I'll call lame science. I showed you some examples where the data was cherry picked, if you will. It's not good. In fact, my next book, I'm really going into that and detailing. When you look at a lot of this, you would be outraged at some of the things that are done to justify man-made catastrophic warming, and it's not good. How does the layman do it? I've got my book, Inconvenient Facts, and I've got there are 20 pages of sources and references in the back. There's really not been much in dispute or anything in the book that's been in dispute. A lot of people don't like me and what I have to say, and they don't like what the CO2 Coalition has to say. But we are providing this network of top-notch scientists from all types, atmospheric physicists, climatologists, and the like.
I mean, I'm hogging the Q&A. Colin, Matt, Mike, you guys jump in.
I guess one of the obvious questions in response to that would be, what is causing the temperature increase? You use that phrase, natural forces. That's a little vague. What specifically do you mean by that?
That's a darn good question, and I do not know the answer to that. I do know that it's highly unlikely that CO2 is the main driver. If you had somebody come on the show and says, well, this is the reason, this is what's causing it, I'm not sure. It looks like there's a strong correlation between sunspots. We know that there was, for example, the worst of the cooling during the Little Ice Age was associated with a period of very low sunspots. Solar activity seems to be a pretty good culprit for driving temperatures up and down. And it might just be the way the Earth is, we know these big forces, they're called Milankovitch cycles, which has to do with the wobble of the Earth and the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit. They drive the big glacial cycles on 100,000 and 41,000 year periods. But if we look back over the last 10,000 years, there were 9 other warming periods that were significant. What was causing them? I'm not sure, but it was. We can say it wasn't CO2, because CO2 stayed pretty constant. Well, actually, it was increasing as temperature was declining, so it's just opposite. And if you're going to ask me, another question I often get is, well, what's going to happen with temperature going forward in the future? Are we going to keep increasing? Are we going to go into the next ice age? Again, I'll tell you, I don't know for sure, but as a geologist, I tend to look at what's happened in the past, and I look at the other warming periods, and it's pretty likely that this warming period we're in right now will act pretty similar to what these other warming periods look like in terms of both temperature and length. And if that's the case, we may have another 80 or 150 years of warming before it starts going into the cold. And I'm okay with that, because I can look back through Earth's history and human history and find that those other periods that were that warm were just hugely beneficial for mankind. And it's a good story. So my big takeaway for your viewers would be, don't welcome the warmth, fear the cold. Because when it gets cold again, we're going to have similar problems. We'll be able to deal with it a little bit better than they did in the past, because we're not moving food around with ox carts, and we've got refrigeration. We'll be able to alleviate that, but you can't alleviate crop failure. It's just not, can't do it. It's going to be bad. Maybe not as bad in the past, but it's going to be bad when it gets cold. Because bad things have historically happened when that occurs.
So Gregory, one question. I mean, this is fascinating stuff, but I think most of the people we've had in the discussion talking about climate, they've been debating the severity and the pace of change, and debating whether or not it was a top 5 issue or if it was a top 20 issue. But I think the thing that you had, the one slide where you said, look, CO2 is up, temperature is up. We all agree.
Over the last 100 or
yeah. 150. Okay, so we all agree on that. Knowing that we have spiked the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, doesn't it, now within reason, like within reasonable cost, shouldn't we be trying to do something about that? I think would be the question. Knowingly, we mankind have popped that number. Do you think it's reasonable to say within reason we should pay to clean that up, or do you think we should?
That's the bumper sticker. That's the bumper sticker I have on the back of my SUV. I do love CO2. There's one right behind me. No, we see huge benefits to CO2. What's wrong? What is wrong with a little bit extra CO2? If it's not driving temperature change, it may increase CO2 has a warming effect on the atmosphere. We just believe that it's modest and greatly overwhelmed by the same natural forces that have been driving temperatures since the dawn of time. We can see that the modest warming combined with increasing CO2 is leading to an Earth that's greening and thriving and prospering. If you Google NASA, 2 words, NASA and greening, and see what NASA has to say about this, you'll find that NASA says that up to 50% of the Earth's surface is greening. In other words, vegetation's increasing. Less than 4% of the Earth's surface is what they call browning or loss of vegetation. And that's a really good trade-off. We see crop growth breaking records year after year after year. And again, that's a combination of modest warming and increasing CO2. CO2 fertilization effect is a real thing, and it's helping feed the rising population of the Earth. And we should all be thankful of that. No, I see many benefits to increasing CO2.
Well, Gregory, thank you so much for your time and for joining us and us walking through your analytics. I think the one thing we've learned above all else is, we got to, all this data, pulling this data, talking about this data is really important, and we got to do it in a civil and thoughtful way. So thank you for contributing to our conversation.
Thank you so much. I just have to point out we've got our Norwegian language version of Inconvenient Facts was just published. So I was supposed to be in Norway just last month, but COVID interfered. Now we've got our Korean language version also that's coming up. So,
wow. Yeah. Well, I'm also going to have to tell Alex Epstein, I thought, I love fossil fuels, his, that was like, cutting edge. You've outflanked him. You've moved to I love CO2. I haven't seen that one.
Oh yeah, Inconvenient Facts. There it is. So
there's the book. Well, thank you again, Gregory. Thanks, team, and thanks to all of you out there.